Welcome to Hidden Badges Stories. Before we get into tonight's story, take a second. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because every week we bring you stories about the people hiding in plain sight, carrying weight the rest of us will never fully understand. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I read every single one now. Let's get into it. Beaumont Regional Medical Center sat 3 blocks from the South Carolina coastline, close enough that on still nights the staff could smell the salt through the ambulance bay doors. It was the kind of hospital that handled everything. Fishing accidents, summer tourists with heat stroke, the occasional industrial injury from the port. Busy enough to matter, quiet enough that nobody expected anything unusual to happen there that couldn't be explained by paperwork and protocol. Callie Merrow had chosen it for exactly those reasons. She had been working the overnight shift at Beaumont for 4 years, moving through the trauma ward in pale blue scrubs 2 sizes too loose, keeping her voice low and her eyes on the floor during rounds. She did not argue, she did not correct. When Dr. Fletcher Haynes told her she had mislabeled a specimen she had labeled correctly, she apologized and relabeled it. When he told her she'd administered the wrong dosage, the right dosage, documented by 2 other nurses, she said yes, doctor, and fixed it without a word. She had learned within her first month that the fastest way to survive at Beaumont was to become invisible, and she had been invisible ever since. Nobody looked at Callie closely enough to notice the small scar that ran along her jawline, or the way her hands never trembled even in the middle of a crisis, or the particular way she positioned herself near doorways whenever a room felt crowded. A habit so old she no longer noticed she was doing it. Dr. Haynes had built his reputation on the kind of confidence that sounds like competence from far enough away. He was tall, certain, and capable of silencing a room simply by clearing his throat. Nurses who pushed back found their schedules rearranged. Nurses who agreed with him were praised in front of administration with the deliberate generosity of a man who knew exactly how useful gratitude could be. Callie had categorized herself as neither. She existed in a third group he had no name for. The ones he talked through as if they were furniture, present and necessary, but not worth addressing directly. She had survived worse than Fletcher Haynes. She had survived things she was no longer allowed to name in most company. The call came through at 12:47 on a Thursday in late October. High-value transport casualty, ETA 6 minutes, government escort. The charge nurse, a steady woman named Bev, read it twice before picking up the intercom. Dr. Haynes was already positioning himself at the head of the trauma bay, adjusting the collar of his white coat with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed every emergency existed to give him an audience. Callie took her place at the supply cart without being asked. She always did. The ambulance pulled into the bay hard, doors swinging before the vehicle fully stopped. A man in his late 50s came through on a gurney, broad-shouldered, close-cropped silver hair, wearing a military jacket that had been cut open at both sleeves. A gunshot wound to the left thigh, bandaged in the field. 2 men in tactical gear flanked the gurney, scanning the room the way people scan rooms when their job is not to heal but to watch. Dr. Haynes stepped forward with authority and rattled off a sequence of orders that were correct, clinically appropriate, and about 40 seconds behind what the situation actually required. The general's eyes opened. They were the eyes of a man accustomed to calculating risks in the time it took most people to finish a sentence. They swept the room in a single arc, the monitors, the ceiling, the team, the door, and landed on Callie. His hand, which had been restless against the gurney rail, went still. "RIDGELINE," he said. The word was barely above a whisper, but in the sudden quiet of the trauma bay it landed like a door slamming open. Dr. Haynes turned. The 2 operators turned. Bev looked up from the chart she was building. Everyone in that room looked at the same thing. The nurse at the supply cart who hadn't moved an inch, whose face had gone completely unreadable, whose hands had simply stopped. Callie knew that voice. She had last heard it in a dirt-floored room in a country whose name she was not permitted to say in most company, while a man with a sucking chest wound was dying on a folding table, and everyone with more rank than her was arguing about extraction routes. Brigadier General Stuart Oberg had walked into that room, looked at the chaos, looked at the youngest medic present, and said 2 words: "Handle it." She had handled it. She had handled 17 other things after that, in places and under circumstances that had no equivalent in civilian medicine. And then, 4 years ago, she had stopped. She had walked away from everything she had been trained to be, chosen a name from a list of common surnames, and driven south until the ocean stopped her. She had not expected hiding to be as easy as it turned out to be, or as quiet or as hollow. One of the operators, tall, pale-eyed, with the kind of stillness that came from spending time in environments where stillness was survival, stepped toward her. He said 2 words. "We know." His name was Vance. She would learn that later. For now, what mattered was that Dr. Haynes was reaching for a chart with the calm confidence of a man who had already decided this situation was fully under control, and the man on the gurney in front of him was not under control at all. Callie watched the monitor. She watched the numbers the way she had learned to watch numbers in places where a monitor was a luxury you did not always have, not just reading them but reading against them. Systolic blood pressure holding at 112, heart rate climbing, 87, 90, 93. Skin color wrong, capillary refill sluggish, subtle, the kind of wrong that looked like almost fine to someone who hadn't seen it before. The gunshot wound in the leg was not the problem. The gunshot wound in the leg was what everyone was looking at, which meant nobody was looking at everything else. What Callie recognized was something called compensated hemorrhagic shock, one of the most dangerous presentations in trauma medicine, precisely because it hides itself. The human body, when it begins losing blood internally, does not immediately collapse. It compensates. Vessels constrict, the heart beats faster, blood pressure holds. The numbers look manageable, the patient looks stable. And for a window of time, sometimes 15 minutes, sometimes 30, never more, it is possible to look at someone who is bleeding out and conclude they are doing acceptably. That window closes without warning. When it does, the collapse is sudden and catastrophic, and the margin for recovery drops to nearly nothing within moments. A gunshot wound had caused a secondary injury, invisible from the outside, lethal in the math. Callie did not wait for permission. She moved past the supply cart, past Haynes, and spoke in a voice that came from a part of herself she had been sitting on for 4 years. He's compensating. The leg wound is a distraction. He's bleeding somewhere we're not seeing yet. He needs a fast exam right now, and if I'm right about the source, he needs the ore in the next 15 minutes, or his pressure's going to drop off a cliff and we won't get it back. Haynes turned toward her, with an expression she had seen on men who discovered a piece of furniture had spoken. "Nurse Merrow, I didn't ask for." "Doctor," Vance said quietly. One word. The way Haynes stopped mid-sentence suggested it was not the first time someone with that particular quality of stillness had used a single word to end a conversation. The fast ultrasound took 40 seconds. The free fluid showed up on the screen immediately, blood pooling in the abdominal cavity, the body flooding itself from the inside while the thigh wound drew every eye in the room toward the wrong address. Haynes stared at the screen for 3 full seconds. Then he called for the ore. The surgical team would later find a lacerated splenic artery, a secondary injury from the same event that caused the leg wound, undetectable on the surface and fatal in trajectory. The attending surgeon, Dr. Patricia Chu, noted in her post-operative report that another 20 minutes of conventional management would have resulted in cardiovascular collapse. She used the phrase exceptional preoperative recognition and did not specify who had done the recognizing. She didn't need to. Bev had been in the room. Bev told everyone. By the time Beaumont's administrator, Lynn Croft, called Callie into her office the following morning, the story had already traveled through every department in the hospital. The version closest to accurate involved a nurse nobody had paid attention to correctly identifying something 3 attendings had missed. The other versions were more dramatic and roughly as precise. Lynn Croft was the kind of administrator who wore competence like armor, efficient, fair-minded, and deeply committed to a system of documentation she believed was the last line of defense between a good hospital and a liability nightmare. She sat across from Callie with a printed incident report between them and the expression of a woman who had already made a decision and was performing the courtesy of explaining it. "You issued a clinical directive without physician authorization," she said. "I understand the outcome was positive. That doesn't change my responsibility to this institution." "He would have been dead before the authorization cleared," Callie said. Vance appeared in the doorway before Croft could form a response. He did not knock. He set a single document on the desk, a federal authorization header that Callie recognized from another life, and let Croft read it in silence. "There is a credible threat against General Oberg," he said when she looked up. "We have reason to believe someone with access to the transport routing knows he survived. Federal security is 40 minutes out. Until they arrive, the most tactically valuable person in this building is the nurse you're currently in the process of suspending." Lynn Croft was not a person who frightened easily, but she was a person who understood institutional exposure. The expression that crossed her face as she set down the federal document was the expression of a woman recalculating every assumption she'd walked into her own office with. "Callie," she said, the first time in 4 years the administrator had used her first name. "What do you need?" Callie had spent 4 years memorizing Beaumont the way she had once memorized terrain. Not deliberately, not consciously, but the way the body builds maps of places it spends enough time in. She knew which elevator banks bypassed the main lobby. She knew the loading dock that nobody used after 11. She knew there was a room on the 2nd floor, An old imaging suite converted to storage, never fully repurposed, with one reinforced door, no exterior windows, and walls thick enough that nobody outside could see light through them. She moved Oberg there herself, with Bev and a respiratory therapist named Joel handling the equipment, and Vance's second man, a younger operator who went by Zeke and communicated in half-sentences that contained complete thoughts. Posted at the corridor junction, with the flat calm of someone who had been in tighter situations and found them manageable. The threat came through the east stairwell, which Callie had predicted because it was the only approach that bypassed 2 security checkpoints. She had propped one fire door deliberately, creating a path that looked accessible but terminated in a service corridor. She had cut the lighting in that corridor from a maintenance panel she had discovered during a slow shift 8 months earlier, out of the old habit of knowing where the exits were. The man who came through the east stairwell was professional, quiet, deliberate, checking corners with the efficiency of someone who had done this in real buildings. He found the darkness. He found what appeared to be a path forward. He moved toward it. Zeke was waiting. Federal security arrived 37 minutes after Vance's call. They found 3 individuals in varying states of cooperation, and a general in a converted storage room with stable vitals, and a respiratory therapist who had not left his bedside. They also found a nurse in pale blue scrubs, standing at the corridor junction, arms crossed, watching the east stairwell with the expression of someone who had already processed the situation and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. The lead agent, Special Agent Deirdre Fox, flat and precise in the manner of someone who had spent 20 years asking questions in rooms where nobody wanted to answer, interviewed Callie afterward. She asked 3 questions. She wrote down 2 answers and left the third in the silence where Callie offered nothing. Before leaving, Fox said, "Whatever brought you here, whatever you traded one life for, it doesn't cancel what you did tonight. Some people spend entire careers not managing what you managed in one shift." The credentialing board met the following week. Lynn Croft attended personally and reversed the preliminary suspension finding, which the board accepted without objection. A notation was added to Callie's file. Not a commendation exactly, but a formal acknowledgement that her clinical judgment during the incident had been consistent with advanced trauma training, and that her actions had prevented what the federal liaison characterized as a potential mass casualty event within the facility. Dr. Fletcher Haynes was not suspended. Men like Haynes rarely were. But he sat across a conference table from a federal liaison and 2 members of hospital administration, and answered in careful sequence questions about his initial assessment of General Oberg. The answers he gave revealed, in the neutral language of a board proceeding, the gap between how he had performed and how someone in his position was supposed to perform. He kept his office, his position, his Thursday research slots. What he lost was harder to name and slower to restore. The reflexive deference people had extended to him for years, which stopped being automatic the morning after he spent 3 seconds staring at an ultrasound screen a nurse had been right about before he touched the probe. He stopped speaking over people in rounds within the month. Nobody mentioned it. Everyone noticed. Stuart Oberg was discharged on a Tuesday, 18 days after admission. He walked out of the converted storage room under his own power, an outcome the surgical team had declined to predict at the start of his recovery, and which he appeared to consider a personal minimum standard. He stopped at the main nurse's station, where Callie was finishing her charting before the shift change, and stood there until she looked up. "You could have let protocol handle it," he said. "Nobody in that room would have blamed you." "I know," she said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about it longer than she expected to. "Because I've never been able to watch something go wrong when I knew how to stop it, even when stopping it was complicated." Oberg studied her the way he had studied her across that field room years ago, with the attention of a man who had spent decades evaluating people in high-stakes situations and trusted what that process told him. "There's a joint training program," he said. "Army and civilian trauma, closing the gap between field medicine and hospital emergency care. They need someone who can speak both languages without translating for either side." He paused. "I told them I knew somebody. I told them she was harder to find than most people, but worth the effort." "I'm not going back to active," Callie said. "They're not asking you to. They're asking you to teach people how to keep each other alive. That's a different thing entirely." She looked back at her chart, then back at him. "Send me the details," she said. "No promises, but send them." He nodded once. The same gesture she remembered from years ago, in a different room, in a country she still couldn't name in most company, when he had looked at the youngest person in the room and trusted her with something nobody else would have, and walked toward the exit. Bev came to stand beside Callie at the nurse's station after the doors slid shut. She was quiet for a minute. Then she said, "First week you were here, I knew something was different about you. I just didn't know what." What did you think it was? Callie asked. I thought you were someone who'd been through something hard and needed a quiet place to land for a while. Callie smiled at that. Small, real, the kind of smile that had been rare enough over the past 4 years that her own face wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. You weren't wrong, she said. She stayed at Beaumont. The shift schedules didn't change. The supply carts still needed restocking, and the chart still needed finishing, and the salt air still came through the ambulance bay doors on still nights with that particular weight of distance and open water. But the quality of the quiet around her had changed. Not louder exactly, just less effortful. She stopped bracing for the next small cruelty waiting at the nurse's station. She stopped apologizing for things she hadn't done. A second-year resident named Tobias, careful and earnest in equal measure, began finding reasons to ask Callie questions after rounds. About pressure readings, about the signs a monitor showed before the numbers moved, about the things that didn't appear in textbooks because they were the kind of things you only learned by being in the room when they happened. She answered him without ceremony. Plainly, the way she wished someone had answered her, once, a long time ago, as if the knowledge belonged to anyone willing to use it well. He came back the next week with better questions. She found to her own quiet surprise that she was glad he did. 4 years of careful invisibility had ended in one night, in one room, over one word, a name she had buried, attached to a version of herself she had tried to leave behind the way you leave a place with no intention of returning, with distance and no forwarding address. But you do not leave behind what you know how to do. You carry it the way you carry anything that has been part of you long enough to become reflex. And there comes a moment, not announced, not dramatic, when carrying it quietly costs more than letting it be seen. Callie Merrow had spent 4 years making herself small in a building full of people who never once wondered why. What she understood now, standing in the same hallway where she had once swallowed every instinct she had in order to survive another shift unnoticed, was that invisible and safe had never been the same thing. She had spent 4 years getting the first one right. She was finally ready to learn the second. If this story stayed with you, hit like, subscribe to Hidden Badges Stories, and tell me in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. I read every single one. The next story is already waiting, and it starts in a place no one would ever expect.